My name is Jim Fetzer, and I will be your host for this conference. In which we observe and reflect upon the death of John F. Kennedy 50 years ago. Our conference is sponsored by the Oswald Innocence Campaign, which was founded by Ralph Simkay, whom you will meet later in the program. And we chose Santa Barbara not only because we knew Dallas would be locked down tighter than a drum, but because Jack and Jackie honeymooned here, and we therefore thought it most appropriate. In order to understand the assassination, which was a very complex event, it is useful to draw distinctions between the sponsors, those who wanted JFK out and Lyndon Johnson in, the facilitators, and the mechanics, who were the actual shooters on the ground, their supervisors and coordinators. The sponsors in this case included the CIA, the Joint Chiefs, the Mafia, anti-Castro Cubans, the Eastern bankers who were tied in with the Fed, Texas oilmen, and a much neglected aspect of the case, which I believe deserves a great deal more attention than it has heretofore received, the role of Israel. The key facilitators turn out to have been Lyndon Johnson in making it happen and J. Edgar Hoover in covering it up. Just to give you an inkling of Lyndon's role in all of this, he was described as the pivotal player in the work of our first speaker, Phil Nelson, who has authored a brilliant book, LBJ Mastermind of the Assassination of JFK, but where Billy Saul Estes, a Texas wheeler dealer who knew these guys up close and personal, told William Raymond, a French investigative journalist, that Lyndon had sent Cliff Carter, his chief administrative aide, to Dallas to make sure all the arrangements were in place for the assassination. Which means photographs like this one have a new, more haunting aspect when you see a figure in the background who is the primary individual who brought the sponsors together and who facilitated the assassination of his predecessor so that he could become president of all the people. It's a real pleasure to have here a man I greatly admire. He has done more work on Lyndon Johnson than anyone else. The historian Robert Caro had a series on Lyndon Johnson that were scathing in their early volumes, but when it came to the transition of power, he petered out and couldn't confront the reality, where Phil Nelson has picked up the task, the grim task of confronting Lyndon Johnson's role in the assassination of JFK. Please join me in welcoming Phil Nelson as our first speaker.
And you see over here, I'm going to be talking about the first book, LBJ the Mastermind, which I have copies over here and a few more available for sale later. Just see me anytime after the presentation. They're for sale for $20. That includes an autographed copy. We're going to be talking a little bit, hopefully, about the next book, the sequel, which is going to be from Johnson's presidency, that is from November of 1963 on through the end of his presidency and then his life. And we're going to be looking at some of the other treasons. In other words, it started with this. I mean, this was just the culmination of a series of murders, which we're going to be talking about. And then, after the first somewhere between a dozen and 17, the number varies depending upon the source, murders that he commissioned in order to eliminate people who got in his way during his lifetime. Then, of course, there was JFK, who was murdered 50 years ago today. And after that, well, I'm going to save the rest because that book is not published yet. It will be published approximately a year from now, unless I can get the publisher to move it up a little bit. So just stay tuned on that one. But the combination of those two books then will lead us to the complete history and the sordid history of Lyndon Johnson. Who was LBJ? We'll start with that. This presentation is about how the most evil, I believe, manipulative man in the country at that time, in 1963, was able to not only move himself into the Oval Office after years of planning, and my contention is that didn't start just in 1961 with the new ticket. He was well into his plan by that point. It started earlier, and arguably it started back in the 40s. He knew that in 1948 he had to succeed in that election to become a senator from Texas in order to be in the position then to elevate himself into the presidency from there. That was the springboard. He was focused, he was obsessed with becoming president. May I see by a show of hands, how many of you have read my book before, Mastermind? Okay, thank you. Well, you're just going to have to bear with me because I'm going to go over some stuff that you're familiar with, but for all of those who have not, then in order to understand what happened, you have to understand first how evil Johnson was. And I'm not making this up. This is all stuff that is readily available in numerous other books. And the problem is some of those books are kind of rare and old. Some of them go back to the 60s. But, you know, I have compiled this evidence that I'm going to be reviewing based upon these other books, other sources. And the documentation is there. And it's in more than one source. You have to understand that there are many sources that combined provide the clues that we're going to be examining here. Anyway, it's about how the most manipulative man suckered the most malleable man, one of the most malleable men, into becoming a patsy. And unfortunately for him, he didn't realize that until it was too late. And you've all seen the video footage of when or how he how he came to that realization when he shouted as he was being escorted from one place to another that I'm just a patsy. And he had then realized what had happened to him. So I'm not going to go too much into Oswald. I'm going to go back and just focus on Lyndon Johnson and his role. As I said, he had a lifelong obsession to become the President of the United States. And I think it all started when he was a child. When he was about 12 years old, according to Robert Caro. And Caro did a magnificent job in that first book of his, The Path to Power, that was published in 1982. And then he published 3 others since then. And in each case, they became less and less objective and critical, and more until this last one, The Passage of Power, the 4th book. There's one more coming. He says the tone is going to change. I think that, I'm not sure what that means, because if it changes any further, then he will have elevated Lyndon Johnson, and just as he's being presented by many people, including people like Bill Moyers, that we're going to be looking at a little more closely as we go along here. But it was no accident that he did not actively campaign for that 1960 nomination, even though he knew he had to make his move that year, because in 1958, he turned 50 years old. And he knew that from his family's history that his time was limited, that as his grandfather and his father died in their mid-60s, like 65. And yet, so So in 1958, Johnson had friends in the Texas legislature change the law in Texas to allow him to run for a national office at the same time that he was rerunning for the Senate, for the Texas Senate, because his term was up. So he wanted to run in both races, and he won in both, but he didn't want to possibly risk the one to achieve the other. So he was kind of doubling down his bets there. With the help of J. Edgar Hoover, who had been lifelong friends, they were neighbors for 19 years. They lived up in Northwest Washington, and at the time it was considered a pretty fancy area, but driving by there today, they seem like average-looking houses, a little larger than most, but not that spectacular. Until he moved in 1961, upon becoming vice president, he left that area, and he moved into the house that had formerly been occupied by Pearl Mesa, who was, I believe she was a opera singer. But she had a lot of parties in that house, and he thought it would complement his new position, so he and his wife moved there. And that was a much larger house. It was more considered to be a mansion. And after he did that, while he was living over in the previous house, some of his neighbors included Fred Black and Irving Davidson, two of the most prominent lobbyists at that time, men who had actually later, they were both convicted of different crimes of, the financial variety. When he moved, they moved with him. At least Bobby Baker did, and so did Fred Black. So they lived on either side of him in his new house. Okay, so in his aggressive campaign to become the vice president, so in 1960, he didn't campaign for the presidency, period, until 5 days before the convention started. He went to Los Angeles, he put his hat in the ring, and he immediately started criticizing Jack Kennedy and Joe Kennedy, and saying, or he had John Connally say it, that JFK had a fatal disease and that he would not last and that he should not really be nominated. He was trying to get the nomination from JFK, even though JFK had it pretty much wrapped up by then. So that all he did was put a message out to Kennedy that he was going to have the fight of his life if he didn't nominate Lyndon to become vice president. In other words, that was just one of the tools that he was using, so that he would be put on notice that he was in it for keeps, and that message was received loud and clear. Here they are campaigning somewhere, and I think it's a classic picture, one of those worth 1,000 words, or maybe 10,000 or 1,000,000 words. Okay, so what did other people say about Lyndon Johnson? Okay, so Harry Blackstone Jr. was the son of a magician known as the Great Blackstone. He said that he learned more about the art of deception from Lyndon Johnson than he learned even from his own father, the magician. LBJ was a man who understood the art of misdirection, of making the eye watch A when the dirty work was going on at B. We're just going to cut through a few things that other people had said about Johnson. And this is from Robert Caro's first book. Johnson's hunger for power was in its most naked form, for power not to improve the lives of others, but to manipulate and dominate them, to bend them to his will. It was a hunger so fierce and consuming that no consideration of morality or ethics, no cost to himself or to anyone else, could stand before it. Now, this is a hint of when Caro was actually reporting, and he was trying to establish himself at this point as a critical and objective biographer who was not going to sugarcoat his subject, like, for instance, Doris Kearns Goodwin did. Doris Kearns Goodwin, when she wrote the first authorized biography, that's incorrect. It was the first major authorized biography. There were others, for instance, Harry Province, a friend of his who owned a newspaper down in Waco, who wrote probably the most obsequious book about Johnson of all. I think he was trumped by what Doris Kearns, at the time before she became Goodwin, did, because, if it's pretty much acknowledged, even by her, that she got very, very close to Lyndon, sleeping down there, staying with him at the ranch, paddling around the pool. I think he's got this other side to him that makes his relationships with other human beings very difficult, unless you want to kiss his behind all the time. And this picture here, you may have seen it. This is an incident that happened. The White House photographer, this is when Cecil Stoughton was still in that position. This might have been his last day in that position because Johnson didn't appreciate the fact that he had taken this picture. And it's amazing that it survived, but it did, and this is it. And this is showing Bobby Kennedy kind of hitting his fist into that pillar there and accusing Johnson of murdering his brother. And you can see he's a little shocked by it. That picture came out of Madeline Brown's book. It's the only place I've ever seen it. And Bobby said that Johnson very rarely helped when he could help. When we were trying to get votes in the Senate, he was against sending civil rights legislation up. Now, isn't that interesting? That Bobby Kennedy said that about Lyndon Johnson, the guy now known and revered throughout the land by other historians who say, and give him all the credit for that. Even though at the time, Johnson said that he was doing it in the name of JFK, that he was going to continue. We shall continue, is what he said. Continue his legacy. But he knew that he would get the credit for it because it passed under his watch. Jackie Kennedy. And this is taken out of the book that was just published, I think, 2 years ago. Jack would say you could never get an opinion out of Lyndon at any cabinet or national security meeting. Lyndon, as vice president, just didn't do anything. Well, that's very incisive as well. In other words, Johnson did not cooperate with JFK whatsoever. And he was battling him almost as much as he was battling Bobby during that time. And I don't really think that they erred in I think for the record, they erred in assuming Johnson was ever a real partner with JFK, acting as a team player. That wasn't the case. In fact, Johnson fought him on practically every initiative he tried to get through Congress. Because when he blackmailed him, when he threatened him back in Los Angeles in 1960 to name him the vice presidential candidate over and above all the other people who were on JFK's long list. In other words, Johnson was not on that long list. He certainly wasn't on the short list. As a matter of fact, according to Clark Clifford, there's no question that JFK had extended the nomination to Stuart Symington the night after he secured the nomination for himself to be president. But late that night or early in the morning, the following morning, JFK got another call, this one from Johnson himself, and or Sam Rayburn, because both of them went to see JFK right after that. And this is all compiled from a number of other books. And yes, one of those books was by Seymour Hersh. And there are certain people who don't want to use Seymour Hersh for that. They go to the extreme of accusing him, of being a CIA stooge. Can you believe that? A guy who exposed the My Lai massacre and many other. I mean, I'm not going to go through the whole litany of the things that Seymour Hersh has done, but he has a pretty incredible record for not being a CIA stooge. But that's what some people would have you believe. He portrayed himself publicly as being JFK's right-hand man behind the scenes. And this goes back to Evelyn Lincoln again and her 2 books on the subject, on Johnson, the relationship between Johnson and Kennedy. He was fighting them on practically everything they tried to do. He sided with the military chiefs on Berlin, Cuba, and Vietnam, Laos, and he was against practically everything that he tried to do. Kennedy tried to do, always cautioning him, especially about civil rights. The timing is not right. We don't have the votes. You got to wait until the time is right. That was his advice consistently all that time. And as a result, had one of his aides, Burke Marshall, draft that law Johnson was not involved. He was not involved in writing the 1963 Civil Rights Law. Now, you can say, yeah, but he passed the one in 1957. Aren't you going to give him credit for that? Well, the answer would be no, because that was a meaningless, an empty gesture. It had there was no enforcement powers. That was all stripped out. Everything about it was stripped out, and so that you had conservatives actually being for it, Southern segregationist conservatives being for it, and you had practically every liberal against it, even though he tried to engineer it so that they would be supportive of it. None of them. Joe Rao, the chairman of ADA, Americans for Democratic Action, said it was toothless, it was worthless, it was worse than nothing. And so did most of the labor leaders at that time. He was even against selling surplus wheat to the Soviet Union at a time when they had a drought. Their crop was decimated. The people were starving, and they didn't have enough wheat to supply the bakeries to make the bread and so forth. And in our case, here it was in October of 1963 that this was all being discussed. And the silos in the Midwest were full of wheat from the previous year. And it was time to start harvesting, and they were in the middle of harvesting and processing wheat from that year. So we had a huge surplus of wheat, but the vice president, according to what JFK told Arthur Schlesinger, the vice president thinks that this is the worst foreign policy mistake we have made in this administration. Farmers in Iowa didn't think that. Anyway, the question that all of this begets is, was he really against these things, or was he simply trying to save them for his own legacy? When he said, for instance, the timing is not right, we don't have the votes for the 1963 Civil Rights Act. So Kennedy went around him, even though he was the chairman of the EEO, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Johnson was the chairman of that. Can you imagine that today, with Obama having Joe Biden chair something, an agency like that or a committee, and not even invite him to participate in the creation of this legislation? It's kind of unbelievable. It's unbelievable that that isn't well known among people. That's what I find so incomprehensible, and that people give him so much credit for having that passed. Well, if he had so much muscle to get it passed afterwards, within just days he started backing it and pushing it and pushing it. Yet the record is that even Republican senators overwhelmingly supported that legislation. You didn't have to twist their arms. Everett Dirksen was right there to help him get it pushed. But he couldn't get Al Gore Sr. to vote for it. He couldn't get William Fulbright, the esteemed senator from Arkansas, to vote for it. And there were others. Robert Byrd voted against it. They all did. So, all of this gets lost in the dustbin. And so the fact of the matter is, more Republicans, as a percentage in the Senate, supported that legislation than his own party and the Southern Democrats at the time. Okay, enough of that. A Johnson aide, this is by another quote from Robert Caro's first book. Lyndon Johnson believed in nothing but his own ambition. And in his book, these words were italicized. Everything he did, everything that was italicized, was for his ambition. He had the same person, anonymous, said that he had a side to him. He could get very low, and when he got real quiet, it was bad, sometimes very bad. And this is an aspect of Johnson that needs to be understood, because if we're going to understand, just who he was and what he was, then you have to start with this. This is where you start. The character traits that he had. Because unless you understand that, you'll never understand how evil he was. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a psychologist. There are probably some amongst you who are. Well, I know that Peter Janney is. Is he here? There he is back there. So all of this is layman's terms. Okay, I don't delve into this, but I had 2 courses in psychology, 101 and 102. So I don't think it takes someone with a PhD or an MD in psychiatry to understand some of this stuff. If you have the misfortune of having one of these traits, then that's probably treatable and you're not too bad off. But when you combine all this, all these terms, all these adjectives that I'm going to be talking about here, into a single person, when you're a narcissist to begin with, and a sociopath, and you're a demented, mendacious, psychotic personality, and you have bipolar disorder, well, then you got problems. So here's a fellow that wrote the following, Gerald Tolshin. He is a PhD psychology professor. He said that Johnson was a tragic figure, pursued by demons, real and imagined. It appears likely that Lyndon Johnson suffered from bipolar, what was then called manic depressive disorder, throughout his life, a condition that grew worse as he grew older, peaking just as he reached the zenith of his influence and power. Dr. Bertram S. Brown, he was a psychiatrist that treated a number of presidents. In other words, he was an employee of the federal government. Said that Johnson's humiliation of his employees, he would make it a point to make his staff, his senior level staff, accompany him when he went to the bathroom to take notes, do dictation, whatever, and make them come into the bathroom. And some of them tried to do it from the outside. It didn't work out too well. Anyway, this humiliation of his employees was a way of exercising his power over them. He was a megalomaniac, according to Dr. Brown. He was a man of such narcissism that he thought he could do anything. That's interesting when you consider that some of his best friends were similarly jaded. Okay, here's another person who was a psychologist. Wrote a book called The Mental Collapse of Lyndon B. Johnson. The United States was being led by a man who already was, or rapidly was, becoming psychotic. LBJ's grandiosity, his megalomania, and paranoia reached dimensions that could no longer pass for normalcy. Signs of grandiosity and paranoia were present before he became president. But his manic furies and incapacitating depressions, his pathological ego, megalomania, and paranoia were products of his manic depression. So I'm trying to get this out there so that, when I start saying these things about him, it's not something I just made up out of whole cloth. It's something that professionals have said. I'm simply citing them. George Reedy, one of his top-level staff, said this: during his agonizing, depressed days, he spent holed up in bed, days at a time, 3 or 4, 5, 6 days at a time. He just drank and spent a lot of time simply looking up at his bedroom ceiling and lashing out at anyone entering the room. Well, you have to understand what was going on there. And he was referring to 1965. For instance, I don't think it was confined to any period of time. It came and went. And here's Bill Moyers now. Consider that Bill Moyers later, this is in other words, after Johnson died in 1973, and in the late 70s, early 80s, Bill Moyers got to be buddies with this fellow, Joseph Campbell, who wrote several books on the power of mythology. In fact, that was the title of a book that somehow he wrote with Moyers. In other words, he had the main authorship, and then Bill Moyers was also an author. And somehow that was done 4 years after Campbell died. Go figure. Well, but before that, during the time when he was still alive, they did shows together. And it was all about the power of mythology and how you create myths and perpetuate them. And I just think it factors in here somewhere because of the myths that we all got to see in Dallas this morning. And, you know, who was the historian, David McCullough, seems to think, you know, that it was all cut and dried. It was Lee Harvey Oswald. And, you know, that's what we're stuck with. But Bill Moyers back in 1965 said, and that photo was from that period, he would just go within himself, just disappear, morose, self-pitying, angry, while lying in bed with the covers pulled over his head. The president said that he felt he was in a Louisiana swamp, just getting sucked under. Arthur Schlesinger, talking to Bill Moyers, said, we talked about the problem of anybody ever writing about Johnson. Bill said, as he said to me before, and Dick Goodwin has said even more often, that one great trouble was that no one would believe it. He said that he could not see how one could write about Johnson, the private monster, and Johnson, the public statesman, and construct a credible narrative. The emphasis is no longer there because this program lost it. But all of that last part of the sentence was in the original. No, I'm sorry, it was not in the original. I should have deleted that. Okay, he said that he's a sick man. At one point, he and Dick Goodwin became so concerned that they decided to read up on mental illness. Dick read up on paranoia and Bill on the manic depressive cycle. Comparing what President Truman had once said about his being tested by the Russians, quote, and this is again from Schlesinger, Bill thinks this sense of being tested played a considerable part in Johnson's reactions to Vietnam. What happened, Bill said, was an atrocious marriage of ego and nationhood, so that Johnson saw himself as America involved in some sort of challenge to his manhood. And that played out in a press conference down at the Johnson Ranch in 1965, just as the build-up to Vietnam was going on. And he was confronted by one of the reporters there who asked him, well, why are we doing this on the other side of the world? And they, you know, alluded to the fact it was a civil war, and it was on the other side of the world. Why are we doing that? And so he unzipped his fly and pulled out his penis and said, this is why, exclamation points, this is why. And it relates right back to this quote from Bill Moyers. It's interesting now that Bill Moyers, the same guy that I got the term Colossus from for my next book, because Bill Moyers used that term in a review he wrote for the Mark Updegrove book about Johnson, another one of those obsequious books about how great Johnson was, with nary a word in there, or very few words that were at all critical about him, even though they must have known. All these people know what a demented maniac he was, but you don't see it portrayed that way. Here's Richard Goodwin, the other guy. Now, Richard Goodwin wrote a fantastic book in 1988 called Remembering America, and it's a big, thick book, probably 550, 600 pages, and he spent an entire chapter, something like 23 pages, describing what really went on in the Johnson White House, and it's very amazing. He was criticized heavily at the time by Jack Valenti, of course, Bill Moyers, others, who wanted to portray this book as being, and what he said, as a way to sell more copies of his book. But they didn't question the truth of it. They were talking about his motives. That's all. And so, you know, what does that mean? Anyway, Richard Goodwin, among other things, said that we were describing a textbook case of paranoid disintegration, the eruption of long-suppressed irrationalities. Robert F. Kennedy, how could we possibly survive 5 more years of Lyndon Johnson? No, pardon me, this is 1967. This is when he was considering running himself in 1968. And this is what he said: how can we possibly survive 5 more years of Lyndon Johnson, 5 more years of a crazy man? And for a long time, he put off that decision, put it off and put it off, and he was being encouraged by people like Richard Goodwin to do it, because there were many people there who realized that the White House was being run by a madman, and so when push came to shove, finally Bobby Kennedy entered the race. In the middle of March, I think on March 15th of 1968, he finally decided to go for it. This is right after the New Hampshire primary, and Eugene McCarthy was given credit for winning. He didn't technically win, but he showed up such a massive amount of votes. He got much more than anybody ever expected he would. And Wisconsin was coming up. And I was involved. I was a McCarthy kid because I was for Eugene McCarthy. I thought he was just a great guy. And so it was said that there was not one house in Wisconsin that hadn't been reached by the McCarthy kids. And I was among them. Bobby Kennedy: if the American people knew the truth about Dallas, there would be blood in the streets. J. Edgar Hoover said pretty much the same thing. If I told you what I really know, it would be very dangerous to this country. Our whole political system could be disrupted. Well, what he really knew is that what happened, because he was part of it. And he told this to the son of one of the oil millionaires, Billy Byers, down in Texas. That was probably, I put that in there because of the remarkable similarity. Probably the only thing they ever said that was in agreement or in near agreement. JFK said Lyndon was a chronic liar. He has been making all sorts of assurances to me for years and has lived up to none of them. Lyndon Johnson, on another occasion, he said Lyndon Johnson is incapable of telling the truth. RFK: Johnson lies all the time. I'm telling you, he just lies continuously about everything. In every conversation I have with him, he lies. As I've said, he lies even when he doesn't have to lie. All this goes to the character again of Lyndon Johnson, and the fact that it's not understood, it's not reported. Here's a sample of some of his lies, just general lies that everybody sort of knew, and they came to accept them, even though in 1965 also what is the Sigma Chi organization of journalists coined a new term called credibility gap, just for our president, credibility gap, because practically they came to the realization that you really can't expect him to say anything that might be truthful. So he said, among other things, his great-grandfather was killed at the Alamo. But this is like one of those where he kept repeating them, even when he was called on it. And even when he finally had to acknowledge it, he kept continuing the same lie. And he did this all the time. And okay, Johnson City was named after his grandfather. Well, that was just BS, and all his major biographers, Robert Dallek, Robert Caro, and others, have said that was not true. Yet he kept saying it, and he kept saying it, same kind of deal. And so his aides, George Reedy, for example, and Horace Busby, were repeating it even years, decades after he died. They were saying the same thing. And in fact, Busby said once, he says, I don't understand. Some of the people who worked with him didn't realize that he was aristocracy too. That his father, his grandfather, was a leading pillar of Johnson City, and they named the town after him. And here's a guy who worked for him for a couple of decades, and he never figured out that was just a, BS. And that's troubling, isn't it? He should have known that. Yet he even put it in his oral history document at the LBJ library that was the case. Okay, he lied about Lady Bird owning and running the broadcasting business, and everybody said that wasn't the case. She was active, but she didn't have the influence that Johnson did. And Johnson somehow, this is pretty amazing when you think about it, because we have one arm of the federal government, the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, empowered to regulate broadcasters, television, radio, and so forth. And he somehow got them to refuse any license changes for the previous owner of that radio station down in Austin until they were begging for bankruptcy. And so he came in at that moment and bought all the assets of that little radio station that was almost bankrupted and going out of business. And he turned it around, and suddenly the FCC just gave him, every time he applied for something, within weeks he had the approval, over and over. So he expanded that base, he expanded the power of the broadcast, he expanded the counties and the people who were able to tune into that radio station, and suddenly it just turned from an unprofitable situation to very, very big profitability. And yet he always claimed that was Lady Bird's business. It was him and his influence that got all that done. He said that Coke Stevenson had tried to steal the 1948 Senate election. And everybody knows, I mean, Robert Dallek again, Robert Caro, they all have studied this, and all I have done was cite their work. And they've proven conclusively that was not the case. It was Johnson, and it wasn't just that last 201 votes. It was thousands of votes, if you add them all up. But then no one really knows, do they? Because those records were almost immediately destroyed, even before the case was settled in court. There were fires, lost votes, and so forth. So here's some lies about what happened in Dallas, that it was JFK who wanted to come to Texas. Yeah, he even had Connolly write a report or an article in the Life magazine or Saturday Evening Post, one or the other, 4 or 5 years later on the anniversary to say that was the case. But if you look closely, you can find a recording, an audio or videotape of Senator Smathers from Florida, where he said, and this is in the JFK library in Boston, that was not the case at all, that he didn't want to go to Dallas, but he had to because he had committed to London to make an appearance there. He said that Kenny O'Donnell told him to take Air Force One to Washington. Kenny O'Donnell said that was absolutely not true, didn't happen, and he didn't know that they were going to be in Air Force One when they got back. That is, he and Jackie with the body of JFK in the casket. Had they known that, they would have taken Air Force Two. That's what Kenny O'Donnell said. And he said after Bobby Kennedy, I believe he had Bobby Kennedy taken out, that Bobby Kennedy wanted Dulles and McCloy on the Warren Commission. Those are the last people that Bobby would have wanted on there. Okay, here's the Altgens photo. And see if I can make this thing go in a little closer. You'll be seeing this. I mean, you've seen it before. And you can see Lee Harvey Oswald. I mean, this is seconds after the shot that hit JFK from the front, the one that went through the windshield that mysteriously disappeared, and hit him. This is the version that was given to the Warren Commission. You see it's cropped, so it only shows the presidential limousine and a portion of the Cadillac follow-up car. And then right above there, you can see Lee Harvey Oswald, we believe now. And so that's telling. But what that doesn't show is Lyndon's car. So let's go back and look at Lyndon's car. There it is there. With a close-up, and we'll zero in a little bit more on it, and you can see that you have Ralph Yarborough on the right side there, which would have been the left side of the car, and then you have Lady Bird, and in between is the driver of the car, and over there where the circle is, that's where LBJ should have been, but he's not there. LBJ is MIA. And the reason is, according to witnesses at the scene, who stated that, including a motorcycle policeman, who stated that Lyndon Johnson ducked down before they even got to the intersection. He was already down there. He had been pretending all during the motorcade to be listening to the AM radio broadcast of the motorcade itself, and oblivious to all the people who were out there, trying to greet all these people. And some witnesses even referred to that car there as being Yarborough's car. Why did they do that? Because they didn't see Lyndon, because he was already ducked down. And so all during the motorcade, now, and this is, if you go back and look at William Manchester's book, his demeanor during that entire period was expressed with terms like dour and, I'm sorry? Yeah, he was pouting, and he was worried is what he was, because he knew what was coming down. And he was hoping, I guess, knowing what the plans were, well, he had a lot of worries to think about. And, okay, let's look at some juxtapositions of facts. Lyndon Johnson took over the planning of that Dallas motorcade. His men were involved in all the planning. Secret Service, Dallas PD, Cliff Carter, this fellow Jack Puderbaugh, were basically given the instructions to do everything that Lyndon Johnson had told them to do to prepare for that. And that included the route itself, the one that with the jog through Dealey Plaza, because up until then there was a lot of confusion, because it looked like they were going to go right through on Main Street and keep up their 30 or 40 mile an hour speed and go out to Industrial Boulevard and then take a right, and it was actually arguably closer that way than the way they did. And so at the very last minute, at Love Field, instructions were given up and down to everybody in the motorcade, all the drivers, that we're going to go through, we're going to turn right on Houston and then left on Elm Street and put them right into the center of the kill zone. And all of that came, I believe, from Lyndon Johnson, and I explain it in considerable detail in the book if you have not read that. And then he took charge immediately to commandeer Air Force One. And that wasn't just some reaction that he had. He had planned that for weeks. In fact, he took off weeks before that, a month before that, and he spent most of that time at his ranch in touch with a lot of people, a lot of Dallas policemen and Secret Service people and so forth. By the way, on the way out here, I was reading Vince Palomera's book. I highly recommend it. If you haven't read his book, he goes into even more detail about all of that in a couple of different chapters. And so I think it's very well worth it. I'm going to have to stop now. I apologize for, with the difficulties we've had. But so I didn't get to go into the second book. In that second book, I'll just very quickly say that the first chapter of that second book, when it comes out, would have been in this book, in the first book, had the information been available at that time, and it was not. Because this U.S. Marshal, Clint Peoples, who was on Johnson's case for over 30 years, he knew all about those first murders. And I'm sorry I didn't get to discuss the murders, because I wanted to get into that level of detail, but just got kind of lost with time. he was aware of the murder in 1951 of Doug Kinser. And he knew from talking to the policeman who investigated that Johnson's hand was kind of there the whole time, that he was always a suspect, but they never had enough evidence on him to do anything with it. He was onto the case in 1962 when they were looking at the Henry Marshall murder, the agriculture representative that worked right there in Central Texas, or Waco, Texas, who turned up dead, shot in his side right here within a 4-inch circle. He was shot 5 times. 3 of them would have been fatal. The other 2 incapacitating. According to the coroner, there was no way that was a suicide, and he said so in the grand jury. But it didn't stick because the jury was stacked. He had Barefoot Sanders, his appointee as a U.S. attorney, down there monitoring everything that grand jury looked at. And this information was all in Clint Peoples' oral history. That was not released until last year, 2012. And as I said, that's the reason it wasn't in the first book. But it will be the first chapter in the new book, and it will put the finishing touch on that issue.